All right, welcome back. This will be what I think is lecture 22. So this is the continuation of Frans Fanon's On Violence. And so we covered sort of the first half, which was sort of the a little bit of the argument about why violence is okay, and then a little most of the argument about what the colonizer uses to perpetuate its regime. And so this next part will be what is it about the actions and inherent actions of colonialism that Fanon thinks, from a historiographic perspective, leads inevitably, right, sort of like the Marxist argument, inevitably to revolution. And he says, the first is the philosophy of individualism, right? And he says that a lot of these societies that are being colonized are sort of communal philosophies, right? Much of Asia, much of Africa, and much of South America. Very communal rather than individualistic like the Western societies. And he says, however, the problem is that forcing the colonized into sort of extreme poverty and ghettoization leads to the sort of, first of all, the natural disgust of the whole concept of individualism, but also the regaining of the concept of community or brother or comrade, right? Another one of those bing Marxist terms. And he says, quote, individual interests are now the collective interest. Because in reality, everyone will be discovered by the French legionnaires and consequently massacred, or else everyone will be saved. And so he's like, we're kind of in this together because if a few of us are plotting, then all of us are plotting. And if we get caught, we're all screwed. Um, Okay, so the second one he says is the inequality, right? And he kind of touches on this on the first one, but then he's like, I just want to make a full statement. This is another one. Because inevitably what happens is the sort of what he says is the white population, the Europeanized population, soaks up all the wealth, right, through resource extraction. They basically only build up the urban areas where they live, and leave all the rest of the country without any access to water, electricity, whatever. And it causes extreme inequality. And he says, in this so called period of austerity, oh, and he's also saying, even right after, even if a colonizer gives up its colony, this still exists, right? And he says, in this so called period of austerity, he's using the language of capitalism right now, austerity, like everybody's got to tighten their belts and we all got to be poor together, right? That sort of thing. He says, in this so called period of austerity, their success at plundering the nation swiftly sparks anger and violence from the people. In the present international and African context, the poverty stricken and independent population achieves a social consciousness at a rapidly accelerating pace. So we do know that inequality actually starts to lead to extreme views and a lot of mobilization. So this is one of the things that caused sort of the Arab Spring. This is one of the things that caused sort of the overthrow of some small communist governments like Romania and Ceausescu. It's caused quite a bit of problems in Africa and South America, and even here in the United States with sort of the 2008 crash and the 1% move or the 99% movement and Occupy Wall Street and all of that stuff. So when people start seeing that extreme inequality, it's not everyone's in the same poor boat, but just many of us are in the same poor boat. He says that leads to a lot of frustrations, and can lead to violence. And then again, he talks about dehumanization. And he has this really, he's a psychiatrist and a psychologist and also sort of a Marxist historiographer. And so a lot of this is sort of psychological. And so I skip over a lot of it because it's not really my realm, but it is very interesting from a political perspective. And so he says that there's sort of stages in this dehumanization. And the first is internecine conflicts, actually. And he says, quote, black on black crime, right? Or Arab on Arab crime. And these are some of the dog whistles that are blown by racists sometimes, right? Black on black crime, right? And he says, yes, that's one of the problems with that is that you have dehumanized us completely, um, and so this is a sign of an oppressed class basically lashing out, right? It wants to lash out at something, and the only thing in the area is the people who live in my respective ghetto, right? And so I don't even have the opportunity to lash out against a white person because, or a European or whatever, because they're not around me. And so that's stage one. And then stage two is when they start to mobilize and enact violence against the colonizers themselves. So pretty interesting argument and really deep, deeper than my background says, I should lecture on. So, okay, the fourth one, which I find out very interesting, is he says the inevitability of having to build a political party, especially post independence, is that there are some characteristics of political parties that inevitably lead to mass mobilization, right? And so we're seeing some of this. So he says not only does it bring out leaders who are charismatic or, maybe they're wonky or whatever it is, you have leaders who can aggregate support. This aggregation of support leads to mass mobilization mechanisms, which reduce the costs of sort of collective action, right, from an economic or political economy perspective. And oftentimes, the problem is that these people can use race and violence because they're emotional issues and they get people really riled up rather than talking about, the nitty gritty of pothole policies in eastern Nigeria, right? And so it's a lot easier to be sort of a charismatic demagogue than it is to be a really charismatic policy wonk. And so yeah, that's also kind of inevitable in politics. But then he also says one of the big problems with this is that originally, when this all starts to kick off, is the urban nationalists, right? The natives, but who actually live inside of sort of the colonizers' regime or inside their geographic regions, and are the, say, waiters or the restaurant owners or are the sort of low level bureaucrats, or the school teachers and principals and those, the cops, are all sort of in on the game, right? They're all, in a sense, first, they clearly have more than the rest of sort of the agricultural regions or the rural regions or the ghettos. Um, and there's fear, right, that if there's a revolution, they'll lose their privileged status. And so a lot of times you'll get pushback actually from these urban parties to begin with. And then he says basically the peasantry itself is left out. Um, but he says that a lot of times what happens is the urban leagues, the urbanized political nationalists will kick out the more extreme versions, the more violent versions, who will then go to the ghettos and the countryside and mass rally people on the principles of revolution and violence. And so, yeah, really, really interesting ideas about sort of the pathways that political institutions can actually lead to violence themselves. Okay, then he talks about like what changes things from just this underlying mood of violence in our society to actual violence. And he says the first is fear in the hinterland, that the sort of the rich landowners who live in the agricultural area, um, they're very powerful in these colonial. So if you look at a country like, say, Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, formerly, before Mugabe came into power, uh, there was a crap load. Like most of the country was agricultural land, and like 99% of it was owned by white people, and farmed by black people, by native, Rhodesians. And so these really, really rich and powerful people who are kind of lonesome out there all by themselves in the ag area, surrounded by, quote unquote natives, get very concerned and say, "We need you, Mr. Governor or Mr. President or Mr. Colonial Master, whatever it is. We need you to send some troops or some cops or whatever." And so he says, it starts to spread, right? Cops start to spread all over the country, and then there will inevitably be a violent action wherein a cop or a troop kills a quote unquote native, and people just hit the fan because now a martyr has been created. And it's a really easy way to heroize someone and mobilize around a violent incident. And so you see this around the world, right? The Arab Spring was basically started by this this poor kid who was getting picked on by the cops, trying to sell his fruit at his fruit stand. And he was like, "I've had it with this." And he poured gasoline on himself and lit himself on fire in the middle of the street and died. And it was all on Twitter and all of these, and it spread like man, this is not a pun, but it spread like wildfire. And it was absolutely awful, but it's what he's talking about here. Fanon is talking about, and we saw this with George Floyd in the United States too, when George Floyd was murdered. Um, there were videos everywhere, and everyone saw this guy just like choke this man to death for 10 minutes. And America had just had enough, right? And so it's the same idea that this hyper violent incident is almost inevitable to occur because police take things too far sometimes, and that's when it will explode the situation. And I'll leave it there. So I'll see you for the next one, and we'll finish up this chapter, and then I'll get you the final lectures on Hannah Arendt's work on totalitarianism. So thanks so much for being here. Be here for part 3.